Alright, hello everyone, it's T. McLeanful here. So the intellectual dark web lit up over the past 12 hours in outrage over the apparent censorship of an academic paper that studied the variability in males, in human males. There's an article in Quillette titled "Academic Activists Send a Published Paper Down the Memory Hole." It's written by the paper's author, Theodore P. Hill. And I first heard about this last night from Jordan Peterson, and he sent out a tweet this morning. Christina Hoff Sommers, a feminist in the intellectual dark web, tweeted it out. She heard it from Steven Pinker, who also tweeted it out this morning. So the intellectual dark web is up in arms about this, what may be another academic scandal. And what I'm going to do is read the article that the paper's author wrote, because I haven't seen it read on YouTube, and I've skimmed over it. This will be essentially, though, my first time reading it. Let's just read it and then maybe talk a little bit about what we find here. So, in the highly controversial area of human intelligence, the greater male variability hypothesis asserts that there are more idiots and more geniuses among men than among women. Darwin's research on evolution in the 19th century found that, although there are many exceptions for specific traits and species, there is generally more variability in males than in females of the same species throughout the animal kingdom. Evidence for this hypothesis is fairly robust and has been reported in species ranging from adders and sockeye salmon to wasps and orangutans, as well as humans. Multiple studies have found that boys and men are overrepresented at both the high and low ends of the distributions in categories ranging from birth weight and brain structures and 60-meter dash times to reading and mathematics test scores. There are significantly more men than women, for example, among Nobel laureates, music composers, and chess champions, and also among homeless people, suicide victims, and federal prison inmates. Now, there's a very interesting video clip on my channel. It's from when Jordan Peterson gave a lecture and did a Q&A at Oxford, at the Oxford Union Society, and he talks specifically about all of the studies that have been done that show this, why the most violent are men, why it seems that men seem to occupy the extremes of the distribution when we look at these behaviors, whether that extreme is a negative extreme or what is often looked at as a positive extreme, intelligence or physical athletic capability. Men seem to be more varied. If you look across men, there's a high variability among men. So let's keep reading. Darwin has also raised the question of why males in many species might have evolved to be more variable than females, and when I learned that the answer to his question remained elusive, I set out to look for a scientific explanation. My aim was not to prove or disprove that the hypothesis applies to human intelligence or to any other specific traits or species, but simply to discover a logical reason that could help explain how gender differences and variability might naturally arise in the same species. I came up with a simple, intuitive mathematical argument based on biological and evolutionary principles and enlisted Sergei Tabachnikov, a professor of mathematics at Pennsylvania State University, to help me flesh out the model. When I posted a preprint on the Open Access Mathematics Archive in May of last year, a variability researcher at Durham University in the UK got in touch by email. He described our joint paper as an excellent summary of the research to date in this field, adding that it certainly underpins my earlier work on impulsivity, aggression, and general evolutionary theory, and it is nice to see an actual theoretical model that can be drawn upon in discussion, which I think the literature, particularly in education, has lacked to date. I think this is a welcome addition to the field. So far, so good. Once we had written up our findings, Sergei and I decided to try for publication in the Mathematical Intelligencer, the viewpoint section of which specifically welcomes articles on contentious topics. The Intelligencer's editor-in-chief is Marjorie Wickler-Senecal, Professor Emerita of Mathematics and the History of Science at Smith College. She liked our draft and declared herself to be untroubled by the prospect of controversy. In principle, she told Sergei in an email, "I am happy to stir up controversy, and few topics generate more than this one. After the Middlebury fracas, in which none of the protesters had read the book they were protesting, we could make a real contribution here by insisting that all views be heard, and providing links to them. Professor Senegal suggested that we might enliven our paper by mentioning Harvard President Larry Summers, who was swiftly defenestrated in 2005. Who was swiftly defenestrated. Dictionary break. Defenestrated. 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 To defenestrate. To throw someone out a window. Rarely used. Informal. Remove or dismiss someone from a position of power or authority. Hey, professors who write articles, a little tip for you. Sometimes it's better to use a simpler word than a word nobody uses, except people who work in academia. Anyways, this dude was swiftly defenestrated in 2005 for saying that the GmbH might be a contributing factor to the dearth of women in physics and mathematics departments at top universities. With their editorial guidance, our paper underwent several further revisions until on April 3rd, 2017, our manuscript was officially accepted for publication. The paper was typeset in India and proofread by an assistant editor who was also a mathematics professor in Kansas. It was scheduled to appear in the International Journal's first issue of 2018, with an acknowledgement of funding support to my co-author from the National Science Foundation. All normal academic procedure. Coincidentally, at about the same time, anxiety about gender parity erupted in Silicon Valley. The same anti-variability argument used to justify the sacking of President Summers resurfaced when Google engineer James Damore suggested that several innate biological factors, including gender differences in variability, might help explain gender disparities in Silicon Valley high-tech jobs. For sending out an internal memo to that effect, he too was summarily fired. No sooner had Sergey posted a preprint of our accepted article on his website than we began to encounter problems. On August 16th, a representative of the Women in Mathematics chapter in his department at Penn State contacted him to warn that the paper might be damaging to the aspirations of impressionable young women. As a matter of principle, she wrote, I support people discussing controversial matters openly. At the same time, I think it's good to be aware of the effects. While she was obviously able to debate the merits of our paper, she worried that other presumably less sophisticated readers will just see someone wielding the authority of mathematics to support a very controversial and potentially sexist set of ideas. Wow. So there you go. I mean, you have that clip from the Laurier professors where they read that little line in that social justice textbook, Mathematics is Whiteness. Jordan Peterson explaining that regardless of objectivity, even if it's math, they'll try and rejig it so that you're not actually explaining how something is in reality, what the right answer is with your math. You are using a system of power developed by men to dominate and justify your illegitimate power. So that's written all over this quote. And the other thing that's written all over this quote is this concern about outcome, about effect. Not what's true or what's not true, but this perception that the great masses are like these dumb animals that need to be led by the nose. And don't give them information that's too complex or information that, might require them to think through something, because what if they conclude the wrong thing and that goes against my power goals? That's no good. So yeah, that's what you're seeing here with that quote, and it really, really ticks me off. It's look at this. So look at this group in here. So on August 16th, a representative of the Women in Mathematics, Let me tell you, I worked at a place, I just uploaded a video a few days ago, and I was beset upon by a group at my job, and they were called the Woman in the name of the company I worked for. And they they wreaked all kinds of havoc. Their primary concern was perception. That was all they seemed to be concerned about, was how females were perceived in the office, regardless of performance or anything like that. So it's very interesting. You see this everywhere. Um, so let's see here. A few days later, she again contacted Sergey on behalf of WIM and invited him to attend a lunch that had been organized for a frank and open discussion about our paper. He would be allowed 15 minutes to describe and explain our results, and this short presentation would be followed by readings of prepared statements by Women in Mathematics members, and then an open discussion. We promised to be friendly, she announced, but you should know in advance that most of us, have strong disagreements with what you did. On September 4th, Sergey sent me a weary email. The scandal at our department, he wrote, shows no sign of receding. At a faculty meeting the week before, the department head had explained that sometimes values such as academic freedom and free speech come into conflict with other values to which Penn State was committed. A female colleague had then instructed Sergey that he needed to admit and fight bias, adding that the belief that women have a lesser chance to succeed in mathematics at the very top end is bias. Sergey said he had spent endless hours talking to people who explained that the paper was bad and harmful, and tried to convince him to withdraw my name to restore peace at the department and to avoid losing whatever political capital I may still have. Ominously, analogies with scientific racism were made by some. I am afraid we are likely to hear more of it in the future. The following day, I wrote to the 3 organizers of the Women in Mathematics lunch and offered to address any concrete concerns they might have with our logic or conclusions or any other content. I explained that, since I was the paper's lead author, it was not fair that my colleagues should be expected to take all the heat for our findings. I added that it would still be possible to revise our article before publication. I never received a response. Instead, on September 8th, Sergey and I were ambushed by 2 unexpected developments. This is so familiar. First, the National Science Foundation wrote to Sergey requesting that acknowledgement of NSF funding be removed from our paper with immediate effect. I was astonished. I had never before heard of the National Science Foundation requesting removal of acknowledgement of funding for any reason. On the contrary, they are usually delighted to have public recognition of their support for science. The ostensible reason for this request was that our paper was unrelated to Sergey's funded proposal. However, a Freedom of Information request subsequently revealed that Penn State Women in Mathematics Administrator Diane Henderson, professor and chair of the Climate and Diversity Committee, Climate and Diversity, and Nate Brown, professor and associate head for diversity and equity, had secretly co-signed a letter to the National Science Foundation that same morning. That's another thing about these ideological groups. The administrative pap is so thick within these organizations. There's like so many administrative positions. It's so weird how similar it looks to like your stereotypical idea of what like a collectivist Marxist institution would look like and evolve into. But anyways, sorry, let's continue. Our concern, they explained, is that this paper appears to promote pseudoscientific ideas that are detrimental to the advancements of women in science and at odds with the values of the NSF. Unaware of this at the time and eager to err on the side of compromise, Sergey and I agreed to remove the acknowledgement as requested. At least we thought the paper was still on track to be published. You know, there's that word again, pseudoscientific. I noticed that historian of science that debated Jordan Peterson on the CBC show, a clip of which Lindsay Shepard played in her class, and that's what started that whole controversy. That historian of science, who was himself like a hack, not a scientist, would use that term. He would try and use that term to discuss Jordan Peterson. So there's an attempt to manipulate language often with these people, to flip things, to make what was, clearly objective science using math and statistics and try and turn it into, give it the brand pseudoscientific. And you see the people that are doing that are the pseudoscientists themselves, people who call themselves historians of science. They're actually people in the arts who are, trying to wield an unjustified authority, an authority that they haven't earned, but they're just taking it on because this is about power.
This isn't something they're secreting in. This is the dead statement. Oh yeah, it's that the whole notion of logic and coherence and empirical data, for that matter,
evidence.
The very nature.
Reject evidence.
Let's question the definition of evidence, because the underlying idea, remember, the underlying idea here is that all hierarchies are predicated on power. So if the reason that I put forward something as evidence isn't because it's evidence, it's because it's evidence that I get to have that position of power. And so if you're a postmodernist and you say, well, I'm going to question your evidence, what you think you're saying is you're going to question my claim to that arbitrary power. The whole idea that there's evidence outside of claims of arbitrary power, the postmodernists dispensed with that in the 1970s. That's Derrida. That's exactly what he said.
No.
People are not just misunderstanding what evidence is. That isn't what's happening at all. When they say they want to question the definition of evidence, that's exactly what they mean. When they say we want to question the definition of evidence because the definition of evidence currently supports the scientific power structure in chemistry, say, and that's fundamentally dominated by, let's say, white men, we can go after the definition of evidence itself. And that's how we're going to bring it down. And so the next people on the hit list are going to be the biologists. They're already under attack from the social justice warriors.
I just read a paper that said that mathematics is whiteness.
Yeah, definitely.
I didn't know that mathematics could have a race.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but the thing is, there's nothing illogical about these claims once you accept the central axioms. The axioms are straightforward. The world is a battleground of power hierarchies. That's what it is. There isn't anything else outside of that. And each power hierarchy generates its own internal narrative, including rules for what constitutes evidence, that support and buttress the structure of that hierarchy. And because the hierarchies exclude, then it's in the best interests of the people who are excluded to invert the hierarchy. And of course, they also regard that as just, even though that's part of the incoherence of the entire argument. That's where they have to turn to Marxism. But make no mistake about it, this isn't accidental. It isn't people misunderstanding what constitutes evidence. Not at all.
Now, I've been listening to some of your lectures on this for the last year and thinking you sound a little deranged.
Well, I might be a little deranged, but I'm not deranged about this.
And then this whole episode with Lindsay Shepard just proves that every dimension of this is about power. The doublespeak, the changing of terminology from harm, the exposing people to ideas could be violent, the sacred circling around the victim group.
Well, look at what happened at Wilfrid Laurier. One of the things that was so bloody interesting, that I thought was just fascinating, was the unbelievably strategic attempt to transform Shepard into the perpetrator and Rambukana and Pimlott into the victims, especially Rambukana as a professor of color, right? So what happens, the reverse narrative was, well, Lindsay Shepard was using something like her white privilege and her white tears, to harass a poor professor of color, untenured professor of color. And there was every attempt made on the part of the people who were going after Shepard to make that the narrative.
So, moving on. But that same day, the Mathematical Intelligencer's editor-in-chief, Marjorie Senecal, notified us that, with deep regret, she was rescinding her previous acceptance of our paper. Several colleagues, she wrote, had warned her that publication would provoke extremely strong reactions, and there existed a very real possibility that the right-wing media may pick this up and hype it internationally. It's all concern about perception, regardless of the truth. For the second time in a single day, I was left flabbergasted. You and me both, buddy. Working mathematicians are usually thrilled if even 5 people in the world read our latest article. Now some progressive faction was worried that a fairly straightforward logical argument about male variability might encourage the conservative press to actually read and cite a science paper. I bet you it was the Climate and Diversity Committee. In my 40 years of publishing research papers, I had never heard of the rejection of an already accepted paper, and so I emailed Professor Senecal. She replied that she had received no criticisms on scientific grounds, and that her decision to rescind was entirely about the reaction she feared our paper would elicit. By way of further explanation, Senecal even compared our paper to the Confederate statues that had recently been removed from the courthouse lawn in Lexington, Kentucky. In the interest of setting our arguments in a more responsible context, she proposed instead that Sergei and I participate in a roundtable discussion of our hypothesis argument, the proceedings of which the Intelligencer would publish in lieu of our paper. Her decision, we learned, enjoyed the approval of Springer, one of the world's leading publishers of scientific books and journals. An editorial director of Springer's Mathematics later apologized to me twice in person, but did nothing to reverse the decision or to support us at the time. So what in the world had happened at the Intelligencer? Unbeknownst to us, Amy Wilkinson, a senior professor of mathematics at the University of Chicago, had become aware of our paper and written to the journal to complain. A back and forth had ensued. Wilkinson then enlisted the support of her father, a psychometrician and statistician, who wrote to the Intelligencer, an ally, who wrote to the Intelligencer at his daughter's request to express his own misgivings, including his belief that this article oversimplifies the issues to the point of embarrassment. Invited by Professor Senecal to participate in the proposed roundtable discussion, he declined, admitting to Senecal that others are more expert on this than he is. We discovered all this after he gave Senecal permission to forward his letter, inadvertently revealing Wilkinson's involvement in the process, an indiscretion his daughter would later incorrectly blame on the Intelligencer. Oh, and by the way, like all stories dealing with these people, they are always long and convoluted because of the types of things these people do behind your back to screw with you. And if it wasn't for so many people coming out and telling these stories, individually, you'd think, a person was paranoid or making something up. But these stories just keep coming out one after another of this Machiavellian, duplicitous activity behind the scenes. Anyways, let's continue. I wrote polite emails directly to both Wilkinson and her father, explaining that I plan to revise the paper for resubmission elsewhere and asking for their criticisms or suggestions. I also sent a more strongly worded point-by-point rebuttal to her father. Neither replied. Instead, even long after the Intelligencer rescinded acceptance of the paper, Wilkinson continued to trash both the journal and its editor-in-chief on social media, inciting her Facebook friends with the erroneous allegation that an entirely different and more contentious article had been accepted. So there you go. Now he's got the mob. The mob knows, and they're after him. At this point, faced with career-threatening reprisals from their own departmental colleagues and the Diversity Committee at Penn State, as well as displeasure from the NSF, Sergei and his colleagues who had done computer simulations for us withdrew their names from the research. Fortunately for me, I am now retired and rather less easily intimidated. One of the benefits of being a Vietnam combat veteran and former U.S. Army Ranger, I guess. So I continued to revise the paper and finally posted it on the online mathematics archives. Yeah, like the kind of stuff these people will put you through, you almost need like veteran level nerves of steel to deal with it. They can really put you through the grinder. On October 13, a lifeline appeared. Igor Rivin, an editor in the widely respected online research journal, the New York Journal of Mathematics, got in touch with me. He had learned about the article and from my erstwhile co-author read the archived version and asked me if I'd like to submit a newly revised draft for publication. Rivin said that Mark Steinberger, the NYJM's editor, that's the New York Journal of Mathematics, was also very positive and that they were confident the paper would referred fairly quickly. I duly submitted a new draft, this time as the sole author, and after a very positive referee's report and a handful of supervised revisions, Steinberger wrote to confirm publication on November 6, 2017. Relieved that the ordeal was finally over, I forwarded the link to interested colleagues. 3 days later, however, the paper had vanished, and a few days after that, a completely different paper by different authors appeared at exactly the same page of the same volume where mine had once been. As it turned out, Amy Wilkinson is married to Ben Farb, a member of the New York Journal of Math. Oh gosh, this is so familiar. You guys, after this, go watch my Laurier video I dropped, the one I dropped right before this. This is all, it's incestuous, duplicitous, people who create these networks and work behind the scenes to exert power, illegitimate power, trying to prevent the truth from coming out, trying to prevent science from being done. Anyways, Amy Wilkinson is married to Benson Farb, a member of the New York Journal of Mathematics editorial board. Upon discovering that the journal had published my paper, Professor Farb had written a furious email to Steinberger demanding that it be deleted at once. Riven, he complained, is well known as a person with extremist views who likes to pick fights with people via inflammatory statements. Farb's father-in-law, a famous statistician, he went on, had already poked many holes in a ridiculous paper. My paper was politically charged and pseudoscience and a piece of crap, and by encouraging the New York Journal of Mathematics to accept it, Riven had violated a scientific duty for purely political ends. Unaware of any of this, of course, I wrote to Steinberger on November 14th to find out what had happened. I pointed out that if the deletion were permanent, it would leave me in an impossible position. I would not be able to republish anywhere else because I would be unable to sign a copyright form declaring that it had not already been published elsewhere. Steinberger replied later that day, half his board, he explained unhappily. I told him that unless he pulled the article, they would all resign and harass the journal he had founded 25 years earlier until it died. This makes me so mad. Faced with the loss of his own scientific legacy, he had capitulated. A publication in a dead journal he offered wouldn't help you. These people, like when you talk about what they're doing in academia, this is why Jordan Peterson gets so angry. This is why he decided to sue Wilfrid Laurier University. And when he announced that decision, like, I was kind of lukewarm. I'm on the side of, is suing the best thing? But like, look at this. What the frack, man? Like, these people are insinuating themselves and using collectivist group power tactics to smother the truth. Colleagues I spoke to were appalled. None of them had ever heard of a paper in any field being disappeared after formal publication. Rejected prior to publication? Of course. Retracted? Yes, but only after an investigation, the results of which would then be made public by way of explanation. But simply disappeared? Never. If a formally referred and published paper can later be erased from the scientific record and replaced by a completely different article without any discussion with the author or any announcement in the journal, what will this mean for the future of electronic journals? Meanwhile, Professor Wilkinson had now widened her existing social media campaign against the intelligentsia to include attacks on the New York Journal of Mathematics and its editorial staff. As recently as April of this year, she was threatening Facebook friends with unfriending unless they severed social media ties with Riven. This is why I'm not on Facebook. It's a weird platform. It makes people behave in weird ways that I don't understand, probably because I'm an old man. In early February, a friend and colleague suggested that I write directly to University of Chicago President Robert Zimmer to complain about the conduct of Farb and Wilkinson, both of whom are University of Chicago professors. The previous October, the conservative New York Times columnist Bret Stephens had called Zimmer America's best university president. The week after, I wrote to Zimmer, the Wall Street Journal would describe Chicago as the free speech university based upon its president's professed commitment to the principles of free inquiry and expression. Furthermore, Professor Zimmer is a mathematician from the same department and even the same subfield as Farb and Wilkinson. The husband-wife team who had successfully suppressed my variability hypothesis research and trampled on the principles of academic liberty. Surely I would receive a sympathetic hearing here. Sorry, I keep flubbing while I'm reading because I keep reading things that are like it's the same as what happened to me. It was a husband-wife team in my last job that did this, like a version of this to me. And I hadn't read this far in the article. Sorry, so I'm just kind of getting thrown back each time I hit a point that's similar to what I experienced. And so I wrote directly to Professor Zimmer, mathematician to mathematician, detailing 5 concrete allegations against his 2 colleagues. When I eventually received a formal response in late April, it was a somewhat terse official letter from the vice provost informing me that an inquiry had found no evidence of academic fraud and that, consequently, the charges had been dismissed. But I had made no allegation of academic fraud. I had alleged unprofessional, uncollegial, and unethical conduct damaging to my professional reputation and to the reputation of the University of Chicago. When I appealed the decision to the president, I received a second official letter from the vice provost in which he argued that Farb and Wilkinson had exercised their academic freedom in advocating against the publication of the papers and that their behavior had not been either unethical or unprofessional. What? A reasonable inference is that I was the one interfering in their academic freedom and not vice versa. My quarrel, the vice provost concluded, was with the editors-in-chief who had spiked my papers, decisions for which the University of Chicago bore no responsibility. At the Free Speech University, it turns out, talk is cheap. Over the years, there has undoubtedly been significant bias and discrimination against women in mathematics and technical fields. Unfortunately, some of that still persists, even though many of us have tried hard to help turn the tide. My own efforts have included tutoring and mentoring female undergraduates, graduating female PhD students, and supporting hiring directives from deans and department chairs to seek out and give special consideration to female candidates. I have been invited to serve on 2 National Science Foundation gender and race diversity panels in Washington. I wonder if he knows that, half the women he tutored, if they were ideologues that had been indoctrinated into this social justice, probably just saw his tutoring as mansplaining. Anyways, which is to say, I understand the importance of the causes that equal opportunity activists and progressive academics are ostensibly championing, but pursuit of greater fairness and equality cannot be allowed to interfere with dispassionate academic study. No matter how unwelcome the implications of a logical argument may be, it must be allowed to stand or fall on its merits, not its desirability or political utility. First, Harvard, then Google, and now the editors-in-chief of 2 esteemed scientific journals, the National Science Foundation and the international publisher Springer, have all surrendered to demands from the radical academic left to suppress a controversial idea. Who will be the next, and for what perceived transgression? If bullying and censorship are now to be redescribed as advocacy and academic freedom, as the Chicago administrators would have it, they will simply replace empiricism and rational discourse as the academic instruments of choice. Editors must practice what we preach and lead by example. In this way, we can help to foster intellectual curiosity and the discovery of fresh reasoning, so compelling that it causes even the most skeptical to change their minds. But this necessarily requires us to reject censorship and open ourselves to the civil discussion of sensitive topics such as gender differences and the variability hypothesis in particular. In 2015, the University of Chicago's Committee on Freedom of Expression summarized the importance of this principle beautifully in a report commissioned by none other than Professor Robert Zimmer. In a word, the university's fundamental commitment is to the principle that debate or deliberation may not be suppressed because the ideas put forth are thought by some or even by most members of the university community to be offensive, unwise, immoral, or wrong-headed. Ted Hill is Professor Emeritus of Mathematics at Georgia Tech and currently a research scholar in residence at the California Polytechnic State University in San Luis Obispo. His memoir, Pushing Limits from West Point to Berkeley and Beyond, was recently published jointly by the American Mathematical Society and the Mathematical Association of America. Well, that's it. I think that the article speaks for itself. Many parallels to an experience that I had. If you are interested in that, it's in the last video I posted. Just egregious, disgusting, a real problem. I don't know, maybe Jordan Peterson's lawsuit makes sense. The more stories like this that come out, the more it seems to make sense what he's doing in terms of using the law as much as he can to try and make a change. Anyway, wow. Leave a like, leave a comment, subscribe. Talk to you guys later.